Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and undoubtedly our program today would be best suited for screening around the 4th of July. Indeed, it is occasioned by a fascinating and timely op-ed piece in the New York Times that ends, "Happy 4th of July, Mr. Jefferson," which would have been a far better and more appropriate title for the piece than the deliberately provocative and controversial one the Times gave it, "Is John Adams overrated?" Now, maybe that got better ratings, not for Mr. Adams or for Mr. Jefferson, to be sure, but for the Times and its op-ed page. But better, it seems to me, to ask my guest, Floyd Abrams, the brilliant constitutional attorney and author of the piece, what we should make of its substance and of its title.
Well, I wrote the piece out of frustration. I wrote it because I had been reading David McCullough's wonderful biography of John Adams and Joseph Ellis's Pulitzer Prize-winning study of founding brothers. And it seemed to me that when they got to one of the most critical events in Adams' life, an event for which he should be judged very harshly, they passed over it as quickly they could, as if they were sort of embarrassed. And that was the Alien and Sedition Act, which John Adams signed into law, enforced as president, and which was the single law in our history which is the most repressive anti-free speech law we've ever had. And here are these two celebrated and wonderful writers who have fallen in love with Adams to the point that while they'll use a word like reprehensible or a phrase like it's always haunted his image, don't really acknowledge that the single most important domestic thing President Adams did was to sign into law the single most repressive law we've ever had. And in the course of their writing, they come on hard against Jefferson for reasons we can talk about, but it didn't seem to me that they were willing to focus on a central difference between them, that Jefferson, although flawed and inconsistent and elusive in a lot of ways, was at the end of the day, from beginning to end, basically a great civil libertarian, and John Adams was not. And that's why I wrote my piece, and I just sort of sat down, and this is a piece the Times didn't ask for. I just sat down and said, I can't go on anymore.
Well, now, I don't want you to feel too desperately about this, Floyd, but you'd say, or I would say that this is a love affair with John Adams, but isn't it more or equally much a falling out of love with Jefferson? Don't you feel that there is something more at play here?
Yes. There's no doubt that both of these authors, having done their work and gone through their thinking, were indeed, just as you say, sort of fallen out of love with Jefferson. They found him duplicitous. elusive, as I said. They didn't like his character, and he had slaves. And here was Adams, sort of Harry Truman-like, cursing out people and writing angry pieces for newspapers, and not getting along with almost anyone, and trying to do the best job he could, obviously as president, and a genuine revolutionary hero who'd never gotten much praise, throughout the course of American history. And I think both of them, and it's interesting it's at the same time, both of them have rejected what they believe is the mythological Jefferson.
And created a new myth?
Well, I think so. I think that particularly McCullough has, is so enamored of the plain-spoken Adams, and is in love, as everyone must be, I must say, who reads these books, with Abigail Adams. But I think that I don't want to say it's a replay of the whole Clinton matter, but there is something of that, I think, in the air, that here is John Adams, plain-spoken, what you see is what you get, saying, always getting in trouble with people, and always irritating people, because he was irritating. He was a pain. And here's the Olympian Jefferson, Monticello, who takes inconsistent positions, who engaged in party politics, as if that's a sin, and denied it at the time. And both of them, I think, interestingly, around the same time, reached the conclusions, John Adams is really a great human being, and Jefferson was not. And I am both left with, and on restudying what I've had a chance to do, at least, rereading a lot of the material, I find myself sort of more enamored of Jefferson than before. I was struck recently reading his initial draft of the Declaration of Independence and seeing some of the things that were edited out. And Ellis keeps using the word lyrical about Jefferson, but it's more than that. It's Bach. It's deep musical ability to describe things. Here's a line from Jefferson that they cut out of the Declaration of Independence. He'd written that with respect to the English, and particularly King George, we must endeavor to forget our former love for them. We might have been a great and free people together.
Lovely.
Isn't that gorgeous? Now, like a lot of things Jefferson wrote, it really didn't turn out to be right, did it? We are a great and free people, in a sense, together. But writing at that time, it's just sort of stunning. And it was a little too much for the people that met at Philadelphia. And that's amongst the material that they cut out.
Why did you say makes you think a little of Bill Clinton?
I think that a part of the reaction to Clinton may have been a greater regard for the virtues of being, plain-spoken, meaning everything you say, not being so verbally skilled. The virtues of, as I say, the Adams virtues of absolute probity. None of his enemies, at least looking back on it, no one anymore would ever say, and Jefferson never said, that Adams was anything other than absolutely true to himself. That's a very important virtue. It happens not to be the only one. There are lots of others that matter, but it is important, and it may be in the post Clinton age that seems even more attractive now to some people.
But you know, you're talking about personal characteristics. Jefferson certainly couldn't be relied upon in terms of actions, but could be relied upon in terms of basic philosophy.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether this wasn't part also of a rejection of that philosophy that we are talking here to some extent, Floyd, about those who don't feel all that uncomfortable with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and those who do feel uncomfortable with some of the words spoken by Thomas Jefferson, let alone now the political actions.
I think there's a lot to what you say, Dick, and I mean, I think when you reread Jefferson, you see even in areas in which we may think he was wrong, and indeed areas he concluded he was wrong. His view that France was the hope of the future and that the revolution in France really wouldn't get out of control. But Jefferson was a revolutionary. I mean, he was a president who was not a revolutionary, but his thinking really was revolutionary. And Adams was anything but that. And one of the great battles after the formation of the country, and Ellis describes this very well, relates to just what was the revolution about? What was the revolution? And Jefferson had a much more radical, revolutionary world view, that this was the beginning of revolutions around the world, that these principles were not American principles, but principles which would and should sweep the world. And in good part they have. I mean, Jefferson's language has been the language of revolutionary movements for freedom around the world. And I agree with you that, you know, that makes some people uncomfortable.
It's always made some people uncomfortable. My point, and I don't know whether you would accept this, is that increasingly there are people who are uncomfortable with that. We live at a time, shall I say, of consolidation and of greater respect for the authority that Adams represented. And yet, the two men came together in such a beautiful fashion for so many years toward the ends of their lives.
Yeah.
I mean, not just dying together on the same day, which happened to be July 4th, 50 years after the Declaration was adopted. But again, I wondered in larger part whether you feel that there is a growing conservatism when it comes to matters relating to freedom, to free speech. Whether Jefferson stands now as a person whose inclinations were not that well accepted today.
I think there is a lot of that. I think it is growing, and I know that the Jefferson enemies then and now would tell you that you're being too kind to him because he wasn't that consistent about free speech either. But your broader point, I think, is well taken, and that is the language of the Declaration of Independence in particular is language that makes people uncomfortable. Now, an interesting thing has happened. Conservatives, very conservative people, have taken up the Declaration of Independence as if it was theirs. Clarence Thomas, for one, for example, wrote articles about it. Very right-wing groups love it because it seems to be based on natural law and has references which they use for the proposition that all states, all governments are wicked, and that everything is personal, internal, and the like, which they like in part because it helps them beat back economic regulations. But I do think that there is a resistance, a growing resistance to the call for freedom embodied in Jefferson's great prose. While, as I say, there are areas in which Jefferson himself acknowledged that his enthusiasm, his passion for certain things led him astray, as regards France, for example, that one of the reasons that Jefferson is under attack today, and he is not so much his inconsistencies, real inconsistencies, but what he really was saying at his best. I mean, the sort of passionate cry for freedom in Jefferson's writing and philosophy makes people uncomfortable.
There is another aspect to your op-ed piece that I made some reference to. I don't know the degree to which you're willing to pursue it, but I think you told me that when the Jerusalem Post reprinted,
when the Israeli paper Haaretz translated it and published it in Israel, they titled it "Happy Birthday, Mr. Jefferson,"
which was quite logical because that's the way you ended it.
Yes, and then that's what I meant. I was critical of Adams, but I really wasn't saying that Adams was overrated. I was saying that these authors had essentially refused to look at reality in the face, and that they had to that extent overrated him. But I wouldn't have titled it that way.
Well, you're being very kind by saying you wouldn't have titled it that way. I really want to deal with the fact that not an uncontroversial or non-controversial piece, but an analytic piece was made into a contest between Jefferson and Adams. Yeah. This is your free press, Mr. Abrams.
Yes, well, Jefferson would have understood, and I think he would have enjoyed the whole thing, and I think he would have enjoyed the letters that followed. Also, one that I thought was especially amusing was by a biographer of Abigail Adams, who in essence said, "How can I blame Adams for one signature? How can I hold him accountable for one signature on one bill?" As if one ought not to hold historical figures accountable for just that.
Of course, at the same time, the letter that the Times chose to lead with, Richard Brookhiser's, he said, come on, Floyd Abrams is perpetuating a myth as old as Thomas Jefferson when he credits him with ending the reign of witches begun by the Sedition Act. And he says, he makes the point that, and I don't share it, and I think he misreads history, but he makes the point that Jefferson wasn't above not throwing quite as many people into quite as dire prisons, but he wasn't averse to scaring people with threats. No?
Look, there was a state, not federal, sedition prosecution in New York. Mr. Brookhiser's hero, Alexander Hamilton, defended the accused editor. It was the Republicans, Jefferson's party, that was behind that. Jefferson was not immune from occasional censorial instincts, but the core of Jefferson, I think it's fair to say, was one which did put free speech and free expression at the very top of the list of causes to be protected. And he was, in general, a very protective person of free speech while he was president. And it is simply a fact that he made no effort to revive the Alien and Sedition Acts, which expired by their terms at the end of John Adams' presidency. another extraordinary event. I mean, just to pause on that. I mean, here we have this terribly repressive law, which makes it essentially a crime to say anything bad about the president and a wide range of other officials in Washington, except the vice president, because he was Jefferson, and which expired by its terms at the end of Adams' presidency, so that it could not be used by the next president against the Federalist newspapers.
Those founders were pretty damn clever, weren't they?
They were, and they were very human, and certainly one of the things that both books, the McCullough and the Ellis book, are very good, I think, at pointing out is the humanity of our leaders. I mean,
they were just like us.
They fought and battled. I wish I could think that we were just like them.
That isn't what
but
I said.
I really don't.
Right.
I mean, that they had the same human frailties, but I would feel a lot more comfortable as a citizen if I thought that there were a few folks around with the talent that they had.
You know, well, it's like John Kennedy's comment about when he had all those Nobel laureates in the White House saying such an accumulation of talent hadn't existed in that room since Thomas Jefferson dined there alone.
Yes.
You know,
Kennedy was a fine president for that line alone.
Floyd, you talked about the core of Jefferson's belief. I don't think we're very good at identifying the core of a person's belief and then permitting actions to be taken that seem to run against that without denying that core, James McGregor Burns and Arthur Schlesinger were at this table taping programs, respectively, different programs. We're talking about the lion and the fox, FDR. And I always think of the lion and the fox when dealing with Thomas Jefferson, because there was the fox who was a politician, and Jefferson was, but a lion, a leader, and a thoughtful person who knew what it was he wanted, the core of Thomas Jefferson.
Well, one of the things I think is difficult to deal with is that in Jefferson you have someone who, much as he may have hidden it from himself, wanted power. He wanted to be president. He wanted to have his party, the Republicans, in control.
For a good reason.
Indeed, for good reasons, but one of the reasons was he thought he would do a better job. But I distinguish that, in a sense, from philosophy. I mean, at the time of the early days in the Republic, of course, I mean, it was thought to be bad form. Adams said of Jefferson, as if it was one of the worst things that you could say about him, that he was actively involved in trying to get elected. And you know, there was something in the air, and there were statements of Washington and Adams then to the effect that, you know, one ought not to do that. It's wrong. Well, that's one sort of issue. That's not a philosophic issue. That's a personal issue, a political issue. It's Jefferson, the poet, that I think that we should look back on with special appreciation, more than Jefferson, the president.
But your reading of Jefferson, does it lead you to believe that his search for power, for political power, was for something other than to provide the setting for his philosophy?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm always prepared to believe that people, you know, have a certain amount of ego, and they may deceive themselves about it. But that said, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, the Virginia Republicans believed deeply that the Adams presidency was headed in the wrong direction, and that if not royalist, it was certainly not small d democratic in its orientation, and that it was not at all as committed to the notions of, among other things, civil liberties as they understood it, which is a lot closer to the way we understand it, than the opposite. I mean, that was one of not the only. That was one of the great battles being fought there, and the election of 1800 really was, I mean, a critical, defining moment in American life, and that Jefferson was chosen to be president and did become president, changed the country more than I would say any election since then, other than Abraham Lincoln's election and that of Richard Nixon.
Well, of course, I beg your pardon?
I think the election of Richard Nixon set the country off on a profoundly wrong-headed and dangerous direction in a lot of ways. And I think we would live in a different and a better country if Hubert Humphrey had been elected, as he almost was.
I'll go along with you on that. It was so hard for me to take Jefferson, Lincoln, Nixon.
I understand. I don't mean Nixon in that sense, but I mean about the significance of the election in terms of directions. Of course, I shouldn't have left out FDR, but I would include the Nixon election as one of the critical, earth-shaking elections we've had.
Well, I'm looking forward now to what I sense is going to be a Floyd Abrams book on the Revolution of 1800.
Well, I'm working on a book. I'm not sure if that'll be in it, but if not, I hope I can come back and talk some more about it.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Floyd, that op-ed piece provoked me so and stimulated me. I can't say to people run out and get it, but on the if you've been willing to give up some of your authorial rights,
I
then
gave them up.
They can get it on the web.
July 3rd.
Floyd Abrams, thanks so much for joining me again today. And thanks to you too in the audience. I hope that you join us again here next time. If you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.